Hello, good evening. I'm Pete Fryer. I'm the chairman of the London Heathrow Branch of the Royal Aeronautical Society. Once again, tonight we're attempting to deliver both live and Teams webinar. So it's a hybrid event, as the posh new words go. Tonight's event is the third lecture of the 2022-23 season and is our Christmas lecture. Our guest, Professor Michael Bagshaw. Hello, Mike. Will give a talk titled My Journey Through Aviation Medicine. To all of you, I wish you a very big welcome to the Heathrow branch of the Royal Aeronautical Society and a very happy Christmas period coming up. It's great to see our branch members here in person in this room. And I would remind you that despite the absence of ongoing government guidance and of news items covering COVID-19, the virus hasn't gone away, so you need to be social and look after yourself while you're here tonight. Mike may even talk about COVID, I don't know. It's also great to see so many of you watching an event from home on your computer or smartphone. I'm going to introduce our speaker. We've secured Professor Michael Bagshaw, as I said, as our Christmas lecturer, and he is far from being a stranger to Heathrow or to British Airways. He was British Airways' head of medical services and has previously lectured to Heathrow branch on technical aspects of aviation medicine and physiology, it says here. The visit this time is his lecture, My Journey Through Aviation Medicine. He's back to give us a light-hearted biographical picture of the highlights of his unique, full and varied career, unrivaled, I think, by anyone I know. I don't think I've ever seen anyone with as many stars in different corners. After medical training, Mike joined the Royal Air Force as a medical officer, and during a 16-year commission, he also qualified and served as a Hunter and a Jaguar pilot, a flying instructor, and a test pilot. Now you begin to see what I mean about stars in every corner of the employment box. On retirement from the Armed Forces, he worked in the NHS as a general practitioner and as a hospital consultant. But as aviation ran in his blood, he was soon appointed as the head of medical services at British Airways for 12 years before becoming director and professor of aviation medicine at King's College London and a visiting professor at Cranfield University, definitely a good university, that one. During this period, as an RAF volunteer reserve qualified flying instructor, he instructed part-time in the Bulldog at the Oxford University Air Squadron. He holds an ATPL and was a part-time Hawker business jet captain at Farnborough. He owned a twin Comanche and still flies a Bulldog and is a CAA flight instructor and flight examiner. He's past president of the Aerospace Medical Association and the Airlines Medical Directors Association. Mike has published more than 100 scientific papers and contributed to the major textbooks. Recently retired as an honorary civilian consultant advisor in aviation medicine to the British Army. He is chairman of the UK GASCO, the General Aviation Safety Council, and medical advisor to the Historic Aircraft Association. To all of our audience online today, if you have questions for Mike, I encourage you to pose them through the Q&A button with the Q&A window, which can be opened with a question mark button. After the lecture, I'll pose these to Mike, or I hope William will be able to catch them on his computer. William will pose them to Mike. If you're in the audience, please wait to the end. Raise your hand at the end and I'll ask you to speak. So that's your opportunity to talk. I'm going to pass you over to Mike, who will present his lecture, My Journey Through Aviation Medicine. Mike, I wish you a very warm welcome to the Royal Aeronautical Society's Heathrow branch. Carry on, please. I'm really looking forward to this.
After that introduction, I just have to tell you that I'm only 19 years old. So, so
not a star in another 4 years.
But good evening, and thank you all for turning out on this cold night, and welcome to those tuning in. I feel rather like the announcer on BBC Radio 3 introducing choral evensong on Wednesday afternoon, when they say, welcome to Waterside Cathedral, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to those people worshipping from home. So thank you very much. So my journey through aviation medicine, it's fantastic. And what I'm proposing to do this evening is sort of just dip into some technical stuff just to keep you interested and fill in some of the gaps. And I'm often asked, who am I? There I am learning to fly back in the early days, and the bow tie is ubiquitous, so you can see that even when I flew there. Well, it all began way back in 1956 when I was 10 years old, and my father was a flying instructor in the Royal Air Force at RAF Hamilton. He was instructing on the piston provost, and as a 10-year-old, I was really keen on what was going on. And living round the corner from us, on the in the married quarters, was a student, a rather mature student who had this splendid Wolseley, and I noticed on the front of this Wolseley there was a British Medical Association badge. So being an inquisitive sort of chap, I said, "Why have you got a BMA badge on your car?" He said, "Well," he said, "I'm an RAF medical officer and I'm learning to fly." So I said, "Why?" "Well, why?" He got his wings, and then he talked to me about aviation medicine, what it's about. And as you probably know, it's a branch of occupational medicine. It covers the military, it covers the authorities, the airlines, their individuals. And the real thing is it's all about flight safety, licensing standards, accident investigation. Well, as a 10-year-old, I wasn't really interested in that. But what really enthused me was when he started talking about the atmosphere and how that affects physiology, how that affects people who fly. But you see, aviation medicine goes back long before 1956. It all started in 1783. I'll leave that, you can read that. So that was the beginning of aviation medicine, which is look where you're treading, really, is the main thing. Anyway, my father retired from the RAF, and we moved down to Luton, where my father was now a civilian, and he was the senior controller at Luton, responsible for the development of Luton, actually. And my introduction to practical aviation then was handling baggage. And I was talking earlier, I was looking at the constellations out there, and this was an BOAC constellation, Hotel Echo November, and this company called Euravia was formed round 4 ex-BOAC constellations to do holiday trips to Rimini and Mallorca and places like that. They usually return to Luton just on 3 engines, belching smoke from the fine. And when I would be loading bags into the front baggage hold, I would often find hydraulic leaks and things like that, and I was told, just never mind, just put the bags in. So Euravia really didn't have a very good reputation, so they got rid of the constellations and bought some ex-BOAC Britannias and renamed themselves as Britannia Airways. And of course the rest is history, and they became a very fine airline, and they went into the jet age, and they've been absorbed and so on. My memory is stirred, of course, with the current weather we have. Do you remember 1962, the terrible weather? And Luton Airport was completely covered in snow, snowed out. So we baggage handlers were brought in, and what they did was they turned on the runway lights, and we were sent out with shovels to try and find the runway lights in the snow. And if you think about it, as the runway light heats locally, you'd get a little cavern of heated snow, of melted snow round the light, but then you get ice forming in the next part. So actually we never found the lights, and we got the local authority brought in some diggers and so on, and eventually found the runway. And my memory, I don't have a picture of it, was of an Altair DC-3 taxiing in, and its wings rode up the snowbanks on either side, so its wheels were then clear of the ground, and it sat there for a week waiting for the snow to melt. But there you go. Now, my other interest at this time, and although I was fascinated by aviation medicine and decided I wanted to be a flying doctor as well, but I was fortunate to have some musical skill, and I spent a lot of time playing music, playing the violin and so on. I was in the Luton Symphony Orchestra, and at that time there was discussion, would I actually follow music as a career? But I decided not to. There we are. Anyway, my father then left Luton. We went down to Swansea, and he ran Swansea Airport. when it was a proper airport, and Cardiff was still RAeS, and the real South Wales airport was in fact Swansea. So I hung around aeroplanes. That I took these photos, by the way, so I was interested in photography, I was interested in flying, and I was still playing my violin. I was in the National Youth Orchestra and so on. But then I remembered seeing at school a poster on the wall saying, "Do you want to learn to fly?" And of course I did. And through that poster, I applied for a Royal Air Force Flying Scholarship. And I was sent off to Bristol Airport in 1965. I took 3 weeks out of school and got my private pilot's license at the Bristol and Wessex Aeroplane Club. Now, those of you who are pilots will be astounded to know that in those days you could get a pilot's license on a total of 30 hours flying. So at 30 hours, I was now a licensed pilot, could fly anywhere in the world, and I knew nothing about weight balance. I knew nothing about stalling in the turn and all that stuff. But I took my girlfriends flying and spent lots of time having fun flying these airplanes. Interestingly, the airplane I went solo on, which is this one, is still flying, and I had my photograph taken next to it on the 50th anniversary of my first solo. So there we are. Anyway, I decided I wanted to do aviation medicine. I was reading about it, I was learning about it. It was so fascinating. So I did the appropriate A-levels at school and failed my A-level physics, which was a bit of a nuisance, really. So I got a place at several medical schools, but without A-level physics, I couldn't take up the place. So for that year, I went to work at the Department of Physics, funnily enough, at Swansea University, where I learnt all about reprographics and technical photography, and retook my A-level physics, and I got an A then, so that was fine. Meanwhile, the flying continued, and I did learn proper flying, and I built my hours as a parachute pilot, dropping people at Swansea. And one day I even made a couple of drops myself, and the exhilaration of jumping out of an aeroplane and finding yourself on the end of a parachute has never left me. But I didn't have time to take it up. Anyway, I got my A-levels, I was flying, I got lots of hours now, and I went off to Cardiff to be a medical student. Well, surprise, surprise, at Cardiff, there was a very fine University Air Squadron. So I joined the University Air Squadron, had a ball flying chipmunks, and got more hours in my first year than anybody else. I also ran the music in the medical school. I led the orchestra and I conducted the choir. And surprise, surprise, at the end of my second year, I failed my exams. So the dean had me in, and he said, "We're very proud of what you're doing." He said, "You know, you're bringing the world to the knowledge, to the name of Cardiff Medical School, to the flying world. It's great, but can I remind you that you're here to qualify in medicine? And if you want to do aviation medicine, Mr. Bagshaw, you have to qualify." So I did less flying, but I still did a bit, and I handed over the music to somebody else. I did qualify. I did okay in the end. I got prizes and things, and I took a year out during my medical training to go and learn about research, and I did an intercalated year doing cancer research at the Tenevis Institute, which was good for me in the future. So I qualified, and I joined the health service and was house surgeon at the Royal Gwent Hospital. And what's lovely is I'm now working at the Royal Gwent Hospital to establish a new medical school. So I'm back where I began, and it's really rather pleasing. And I worked at Llandoch Hospital as a house physician, and during this time I got married. I married my accompanist, who was a fine musician. She's still a fine musician, and she was teaching chemistry in Cardiff. So there we are. Anyway, I then joined the Air Force because I wanted to be medical officer pilot. Okay, so they posted me to Lyme. And this shows you the wonders of camouflage. You know, there's 4 Hercules in there, and you've got to look quite hard, haven't you, to see them. And while I was at Lynham, I did my general practice training and qualified as a GP. Now, again, the good old days, after you'd qualified in medicine, you only had to do a year of GP training, and then you were let loose on real people, which was quite stunning. However, I worked very hard keeping my profile up and visiting the Institute of Aviation Medicine and reading avidly about aviation medicine. And in the end, they gave in, and they sent me off to do my flying training. So I trained, I got my wings at Cranwell, I flew the Nat for a while, and I did my advanced training on the Hunter and got my wings. Now, this was great because I was now a full-time pilot again. And I kept current medically by doing nights on call. So one night a week I would be the doctor on call, which of course the poor people who were suffering from my cold hands feeling their tummy had no idea that I was actually a pilot coming to see them, but that's how it was. And then they sent me, I did quite well in training, so they sent me off to fly Hunters at Broadie, and having spent all those years learning to save lives, I now spent time learning to kill people. And that was, I didn't worry about the ethics really, but I had a ball, and I've got thousands of hours on Hunters, and I was an instructor on the Hunter, and it's great. But they decided I was having too good a time, so they said, right, you better go and be a flying instructor. So they sent me off to the Central Flying School. I became a flying instructor, and one of the great joys actually was I won the aerobatic trophy exactly 25 years after my father had won it. And it was quite funny. When I qualified in medicine, my father said, "Oh, well done, yes, jolly good." But when I won the Clarkson Trophy, we had a party and it was in the papers, and there was lots of fuss. But do you know what? Being an instructor is a way to learn about yourself and learn about your flying and to really understand what goes on. And I thoroughly enjoyed my time there, and I was privileged to fly people who became very senior. The current Chief of the Air Staff, Mike Wigston, was a student of mine at one time, so hasn't he done well? But, you know, I thought, well, what's next? Well, they then sent me to fly the Jaguar. Now, the Jaguar at that time was the new aeroplane, and I mean, despite all you may hear about the limitations of the Jaguar, it was actually a very splendid piece of equipment. It was demanding to fly, but it was the best way of delivering a bucket of sunshine to the red square if you needed to. It was very good in a straight line at low level. And I learned a lot flying the Jaguar, using head-up displays, using modern techniques. This was all before GPS. So we were still using maps, stopwatches, and there was a rather primitive analog computer in the aeroplane. And if the moving map was within 5 miles at the end of the hour, you thought it had done really well. Anyway, I still wanted to do aviation medicine, and I still belonged to the medical branch. So they had me back, and they sent me to the Royal Air Force Institute of Aviation Medicine at Farnborough, where I had the dream job. The Institute of Aviation Medicine was the main centre, I'm going to say internationally, despite what the Americans would claim, for research and development in the whole gamut of aviation medicine. And it was built around the centrifuge, which is still there, by the way. The rest of it is now an old people's home. It's all been demolished and been redeveloped, but this is a listed building and the centrifuge is still there. So that's good to hear. And I commend to you the Farnborough Aerospace Museum and the charity that is keeping the going. Just as here at BA, you've got this wonderful museum, at Farnborough we've got the equivalent, a wonderful museum of all the stuff that went on in those good days at Farnborough. So there I am testing something or other, just about to get into the Hunter, and so I did the diploma in aviation medicine. I was sent off to Boscombe Down and learned how to be a test pilot a little bit, and then I became the senior medical officer pilot at the Institute of Aviation Medicine. And I had 6 wonderful years, and I contributed, I think, quite a lot to the well-being of our military aviators. I didn't just fly, I was involved in the lab, so that's developing, in fact, interestingly, that's developing the Jaguar oxygen regulator. And of course, what it's famous for is the centrifuge. And as I said, the centrifuge is still there. And I spent many hours whirling around in that thing at 9G, having exciting things done to my insides, which was great fun. We had the hypoxia chamber, we had the high altitude chamber, but the big thing we did at that time, the height of the Cold War, was the concerns about nuclear, biological and chemical warfare. And a lot of work was being done to develop the respirator and the protective equipment for aircrew so that they wouldn't be affected by the nuclear biological warfare. And effectively what you did is you put the pilot and the crew in a rubber bag, completely hermetically sealed from the outside world. So you can see here the visor, you can see the rubber here, which goes under the suit, and the suit is charcoal lined to protect you from the nasty stuff. So we did a lot of development work, and it's interesting that we were doing that in the 70s and 80s, and it is only now being superseded by better equipment. And even the Americans had to admit that this was the best bit of kit. Well, with a background in test flying and being a flying instructor and so on, I was very fortunate. I got to fly all the aeroplanes at Farnborough, the Royal Aerospace Establishment. All of those aeroplanes I flew, the 111, the Buccaneer, the Comet, the Jaguar, the Hunter, and I also used to be a guest artist, as we call it, on the Met Research Flight Hercules, that we call Snoopy for obvious reasons. And I give pride of place there to the Varsity, because the Varsity is a development of the old Viking, which is featured around here, and a lot of really exciting new stuff was done in that Varsity. Forward-looking infrared, night vision goggles and all that stuff was all done in the Varsity. So I was privileged to fly that, and it was great fun. I also did some helicopter flying until I blew up the very last Wessex 1. I pressed the starter button, and what you can see here is part of the starter motor, because there's an explosion in the thing as I pressed the starter button, and the whole engine disintegrated and spread itself across Farnborough. That was very sad, because that was the last of the Wessex 1s, but never mind, they didn't hold it against me. But I've talked about the flying I was doing. Again, I had to keep the medicine going, didn't I? So I was doing research, physiology, a lot of teaching, a lot of research, but I used to keep my hand in. At weekends, I'd go and be the resident medical officer at Clare Park Clinic. And again, little did they know that their hands were in, their lives were in the hands of a pilot from down the road at Farnborough. I used to put a white coat on. We wore white coats in those days. Put a white coat on and had a stethoscope in my pocket, and we'd walk around being very knowledgeable with my glasses on, but that was fine. Anyway, it wasn't quite as gash as it sounds. I did keep myself current. I did keep myself up to date, and I think I didn't kill anybody as far as I know. Anyway, back to the day job, getting in the Hunter. So we used to use the Hunter to try and simulate what the equipment would be doing, what we'd be using it in real life. I flew the Jaguar as well, and the others, but that Hunter XL563, that's the subject of a lecture all on its own, actually, to talk about how we used 563 and how we modified this aeroplane to do physiological measurements and so on. And it's great, and lots of stuff together, and we'd go off, and here we are pretending to attack a bridge, and there's the number, there's the lead aircraft just pulling off the target, and I'm coming in behind to do that. So I'll give you an example of what we did. In those days, of course, as you saw from the Montgolfier balloon at the beginning, we were needing to have oxygen supplement to let us fly at altitude above about 10,000 feet, and we're up in the 40, 50,000 feet. So we needed oxygen, and oxygen was always carried in bottles, oxygen cylinders. So we've got gaseous oxygen. They're heavy, they take up space, and they've got limited capacity. So if you're flying a combat aeroplane, you want to put fuel in it, you want to put more weapons in it, but you also got to put more oxygen in it. So the first development then was to use liquid oxygen. So we liquefy the oxygen, the LOX pot, which the ratio of the amount of gaseous oxygen from liquid oxygen to gaseous oxygen is huge. And you probably know that many of our airliners use liquid oxygen, but liquid oxygen is hazardous. And when we think about the Harrier that was operating out of a field in Germany, bringing liquid oxygen to the field to replenish the Harriers was highly dangerous, really. So something had to be done, and it was. And somebody remembered that there's this wonderful mineral called zeolite. So it was nothing. No, we didn't invent zeolite. We knew about it, but we knew that this zeolite had properties that if we passed a gas through it, we could filter out the big molecules. So as it says there, the dehydrated will absorb the molecules small enough to pass through. And the good news is, if we look at that, if that's the zeolite plate, the big molecules are nitrogen. We don't want nitrogen. And the little molecules which pass through the zeolite are oxygen. So all we had to do, ladies and gentlemen, was simply pipe the air from the engine into a zeolite bed, and there we got unlimited supplies of oxygen, in theory. It took a lot of work, and here we are. So we're the molecular sieve oxygen concentrator, so we're filtering out the nitrogen, we're left with some argon, left with some oxygen. But of course, once the filter gets clogged, it's got to be regenerated. So we designed with Normal Air Garrett down in Yeovil a basic system where we alternated. We would pass the air from the engine through the zeolite bed, through the molecular sieve, and we'd get the product at the end, which was oxygen, and then we would purge it. So we got 2 going, and in fact we used to make it 3, so you've got 1 in reserve. So you've got an electric motor there controlling the flow. So it's pushing through, getting pure oxygen at one with 98% oxygen at one end, and then purging that while we get 98% oxygen from the other one. And all modern aircraft now have some form of molecular sieve. And the first flight of it was performed by yours truly on the 20th December 1982, the world's first of the molecular sieve oxygen concentrator, or the onboard oxygenating generator system, which is now used worldwide, civilian aircraft and military aircraft. So that was a first from Farnborough, and you know, we're proud of that. So that cloudy December day, I remember it well. That was the culmination of 2 years groundwork, laboratory testing, and proving it works. And the sort of thing now in all aircraft are these. They're all 3 beds, so that we've got redundancy there. And but we do still carry a bottle of oxygen in case it fails. So remember, it's electrical, and electrics can happen. We had a ball at Farnborough. We worked really, really hard, but we had 4 hunters on the fleet. So occasionally we would think of a reason to get airborne and just make pretty paps in the sky. So thank you very much, taxpayers, very much. We had a lot of fun. But don't forget, I was a taxpayer too. So I was paying a lot of tax. So I didn't really have a guilty conscience. And you know, when I was a flying instructor at Bramwell, I was the duty pilot one evening, one afternoon, and the phone rang, and it was somebody complaining about a low-flying aeroplane and making a noise and scaring the horses. So I said, "Madam, I'm so sorry. Did you see the aeroplane?" "Yes, I did." "Okay, did it have a red star on the side?" "No, it was one of yours." I said, "Thank God for that. We're doing a good job," and put the phone down. So I got into trouble for that. That's not the PR we're supposed to do, but there you are. Anyway. So we did stuff like integrating aircrew equipment. That's in the Hunter, and we eventually evolved with protection against G, protection against altitude, and we ended up with the counter pressure assembly for the Tornado pilots, which is the aeroplane which is our frontline defence even now. So that was a long time in development. We're talking about the 1980s, and it's in fine. But other things went on as well. We were I got very involved in the dynamics and in the what goes on in the inner ear. Just as an aside, one day I was at Boscombe Down and parked the Hunter XL563. And for the Regispotters in the room, you can't read it, but we've got XL563, XL564, and XL565. How about that? You know, that we just happen to have the sequential aeroplanes all parked next to each other. So isn't that great? Interestingly, 563, which was the Institute of Aviation Medicine Hunter, was the very first production T7, the first production 2-seater, which up to then they'd converted old F4s into 2-seaters, and ours was the first of the production line. And that's, as I said earlier, that's another lecture, but there we are. My interest was now being piqued by human factors as well. So what's going on in the inner ear, but what's going on in the person, and tying this up with my continuing medical practice and dealing with sick people, dealing with fit aircrew, and tying it all together, I became more and more interested in the human side, and I even admitted to reading books on psychology. There you are. We had a simulator at FFOM, a very primitive simulator, but there we are. And we started looking at human factors and the interaction between the crew and their displays and what they're trying to do. And we're doing a lot of climatic work as well. We were developing stuff for the cold weather up in Norway at that time for the Murmansk Gap, and sea survival. We had a big tank of water, and we used to drop into the tank from a hatch in the ceiling. So we go up the stairs, open the hatch and drop down into the tank, which was great recreation for a Tuesday afternoon. But as I said, I got more interested in what was going on in the vestibular system, and the RAF had a very good program in place for the desensitization, the rehabilitation of motion sick aircrew. So motion sickness is one of the causes is when you get a mismatch of information, when the inner ear and the pressure sensors and everything else don't match up with what you're seeing. Okay, and that's why when you drive the car, you don't get car sick, but the person sitting next to you may well get car sick. But give them the feedback and they don't usually get car sick. And it's the same in an aeroplane. However, it's a bit more complex than an aeroplane, and we developed a desensitization system, and this is some of the research we were doing. And what we would do is give them time, these usually student pilots who got potential but were being held back by air sickness, and the success rate in desensitizing them was in excess of 80%. So we'd give them the ground-based desensitization. I'd then take them flying in the Hunter and build up the exposure to motion, and in the end they could happily come flying. So here we are whizzing around the countryside. We're just whizzing through a Welsh valley here and going to attack a dam around the corner. There we are. And, yeah. I've got to, having done that fast jet stuff, I've got to remind you of the remind you of the varsity, which I mentioned earlier. Now, I'll tell you an interesting story. I mentioned night vision goggles, which enable us to enhance the vision. They're originally called passive night goggles, PNGs. And during the Falklands War, the Americans kindly offered to they didn't want to get involved in the war, but it was anything we needed to help. A bit like Ukraine, really. We can't get involved in the war, but we could just help if needed. So we decided that our secret weapon for the Harrier guys particularly was these passive night goggles, PNGs. So a signal was sent from the Ministry of Defence to the Pentagon saying, please supply us with 100 sets of PNGs. Well, this caused absolute consternation. And it went up to the president, and it came across to Mrs. Thatcher, and MOD was put on alert, and there was a huge fuss, and we said, all we've asked for is these PNGs. Unfortunately, to the American, PNG was passive nuclear guided bomb. So they thought we were going to nuke the Argentinians. So then the name was changed to night vision goggles. So there's a story to tell the grandchildren. Why they call night vision goggles. So we did a lot of that work in the varsity. Well, all good things come to an end. And in October 1986, I made my final flight in the Royal Air Force. They gave me a Jaguar full of fuel, said, go and enjoy yourself. And that's it. So I did, and I went and attacked Vernry Lake. I had some bombs on as well. I did drop some bombs, not here, but on the range, and had a bit of fun. And here we are. So I retired in 1986, and I thought, having flown, I got many thousands of hours. I'd flown 80 different types of aeroplane as a captain. I thought, really, that's it. I ought to go back to medicine. I've had a lot from medicine. I was now age 40, and I thought I had a lot to give. So I went to the health service, and as you've heard, I was a GP in Crowthorne part-time. I was a consultant neurotologist at St George's in Tooting part-time, and I got back to medicine, and I loved it. But my wife said to me one day, for God's sake, go and fly an aeroplane. I can't stand you moping around the house looking at the sky. So I joined the VR as a QFI and went to teach on the Bulldog at Oxford University Air Squadron 1 day a week. So I was doing medicine, teaching students, and that was great. However, we had the changes in the health service, the introduction of the internal market, the beginning of the destruction of the health service as we know it. And in 1990, I decided I didn't want to be part of this new NHS. I'd loved being a GP. I'd loved being a hospital consultant where I could use my initiative, use my knowledge. I built up a relationship with my patients. I did home visits. I was responsible for them 24/7. And it was very satisfying. And I could get out of the place one day a week and go and teach young ladies and gentlemen to fly the Bulldog. But I saw the writing on the wall with the health service. So I went back to Farnborough. And I went to the Royal Aerospace Establishment as the establishment medical officer, and I used that opportunity to qualify then in occupational medicine, because I was practicing occupational medicine, and occasionally I'd get in the back of a Jaguar and go and act as a subject in a trial, but I'm not supposed to say that. I was actually looking after the occupational health of the Royal Aerospace Establishment. That was fine, and we also had to do the medical cover for the Farnborough Air Show. So I had a ringside seat for the Farnborough Air Show, sitting in an ambulance and watching what was going on. So what a good time. Anyway, I got a phone call. Got a phone call from someone senior here at British Airways who said, there is an advert coming into the British Medical Journal next week. We'd like you to see the advert and we'd be very pleased if you were to apply. So I did. And there we are. I ran medical. Now BA Health Services was very different in those days from what it is now. And I started life. Waterside didn't exist, of course. So 92, it was Speedbird House. And the first thing that struck me when I arrived at Speedbird House was we were separated into medical air and medical ground. And the ground medical services were provided on the ground floor, and the air medical services were provided on the first floor. And the thing that struck me straight away was that on the first floor there were carpets and there were comfortable seats in the waiting room and there were magazines to read. On the ground floor it was vinyl tiles and hard chairs, and I thought that was a hangover from the bad old days of this separation between ground and air. And there we are. But it was good, and we had a great time, and I've got colleagues in the room here now who were there with me. Well, Waterside was built, of course, and we moved over here, but health services were the last people to stay at Waterside, and we were there all on our own because in the design of Waterside they'd forgotten about the health services. And the reason the health centre is circular is it was originally designed as the fitness centre and the swimming pool. So round the circle that's now where all the consulting rooms were, that was the fitness centre which surrounded what was going to be the swimming pool. And there was a realisation then of, whoops, we need to find somewhere for the health centre. So a last minute change was made and the fitness centre was turned into BA Health Centre. So we were left in Speedbird House for getting on for another year. Everyone else had moved over here, and we moved out just before the bulldozers arrived. Now, in those days, British Airways Health Services was a much bigger entity than it is now. It's a very splendid organisation. It still is, and works really hard in occupational medicine, looking after the whole range of the crew, of the employees. And it was fine, and it was suggested I went flying, and I did some assessments, and they were going to send me flying, but they said no, we need to provide the health service to everybody. And in those days we had the opportunity to do a bit of research. Now you probably know that the 777 was first brought into service by British Airways, so we were the first customer for the 777, and we had to do some flight trials. I've got these slides the wrong way around, by the way, so I'll go to the next slide. The cabin crew and the passengers complained of all sorts of things on the 777. Fainting, dizziness, shortness of breath, nosebleeds, and of course it made the press. And the Lord's Select Committee sent for me and said, what's going on with your 777? Why are all these people ill? And we had to do something about it. And what we did then was some flight trials, and we thought we'd better look at the cabin air quality and other parameters. We worked with the RAF Centre for Aviation Medicine, the Building Research Establishment, and of course Boeing, because Boeing were really anxious that they were getting this bad press for their new wonderful aeroplane. So we involved all the 777s and we evaluated what was going on. So we did this air quality study. We measured the environment, we did a course, and we found that the crews on the 777 were getting symptoms of greater severity when we compared them with the 74. But the air quality was fine. There was nothing wrong with the cabin air quality. But what we did find was that the back of the aeroplane, particularly in the galleys, the air was stagnant and was warmer, and there was less air movement. And I haven't got time tonight. This is another lecture, actually, the development of the 777 comfort thing. And we realised that many of the symptoms that the cabin crew were complaining about were early signs of motion sickness. And we found that actually the autopilot in the 777 was causing the aeroplane, when it was in LNAV, when it was turning on autopilot, the rate of roll was exactly the same as we used to use in the laboratory at Farnborough to make people sick. So Boeing had designed a sickness-inducing machine with their software, quite inadvertently. So what did we have to do? Okay, so the first thing was there was a comfort correction factor that used to add 2 degrees of temperature. So we removed that, we improved the software, and we modified all the air grills so that it was now better mixing. And lo and behold, everybody's symptoms went, and the 777s were modified worldwide based on the work that BA Health Services had done. So that was good news. We could do that. You can't do it now. The BARS is so busy providing occupational health services that they don't have the luxury of being able to do that. Another bit of luxury, I noticed that about 20% of our flight crew had unilateral noise-induced hearing loss. So the doctors in the room will know that that notch at 4K indicates hearing loss caused by noise. And we look through, I started looking at audiograms and we kept seeing, and what was interesting, it was in one ear only. So having a test flying background, I started to ask the question, so why is it one ear? What's going on? Now, as we get older, our hearing does go off. And if we look at this, that's what we'd expect to see as someone getting older, their hearing drop. But notice that's both ears. Okay, so not side. And my suspicions, being a pilot, knowing what was going on, my suspicions were raised because the crew were using these lightweight headsets. And they always had done. The 707, right the way through, this is how they flew. Because what they did, it's not a very good picture, but I hope you can see that there's an earpiece there, parked behind the ear. Okay, what the crew did was they would use the covered ear on the other side to talk on the radio, to monitor the RT, and they would communicate across the cockpit verbally using the uncovered ear. I know what you're thinking. You're saying, the uncovered ear is the one that was getting the noise-induced hearing loss. Actually, it wasn't. And my suspicions were aroused. So I set up a trial with Southampton University. I'm sorry, it's not a very good slide, but there we are. And we measured what was going on. We measured what was happening with the headset, what was happening in the cabin, and where was the damage. And this is what we found. This is a 7.4 coming from Washington. This line here is the ambient cabin. That's about 78 dBA. That's okay. But in the covered ear, okay, from the RT, look at this. Up here, anything up 98 dBA, and this is over an 8-hour period. And this exceeds the regulations. Okay, so we were deafening our pilots by allowing them to do what they did. Now, those of you who know about noise will know, actually, it's not just the dBA, it's not just the level, it's actually the spectral analysis. And the spectral analysis of the noise they were getting showed that it was harmful in the very part of the spectrum which was harmful to hearing. So we were So my suspicions that 20% of our crew were being made deaf in one ear were borne out. And here's another one. Here's a 7.6, and you can see that's the ambient noise. There's the peaks of noise from the radio. So the European directive was that one, which is to say that the action levels are there, 85 and 80 dBA. And if you, over an 8-hour day, if you exceed these, you're breaking the law as well as thing. Now, that time, health and safety didn't apply to flight crew, but I was able to argue that if we did this, we were doing this to our crew, we were not fulfilling our duty of care. And of course, now health and safety does apply to flight crew. There we are. So we had to do something about it, and we did a lot more research, and we introduced active noise reduction headsets. And these are now the norm, and they're accepted, and this changed practice worldwide. I got an award from the Aerospace Medical Association because we'd now changed the whole worldwide practice of how, and Boeing and Airbus accepted this, and they no longer expect pilots to communicate across the cockpit verbally. So that's a little plus for BA Health Services, and we were able to spend the time, we were able to do it, we were able to spend the money, and we enhanced the health. It's difficult these days. Now, I mentioned cabin air quality. I can't leave this evening without mentioning the dreaded aerotoxic syndrome. Okay, and the aerotoxic syndrome, there have been concerns about oil, smoke and fumes and contamination events. What effect is this having on the crew? And the unions and the bodies representing pilots and cabin crew have been very concerned about this, and causing a lot of anxiety. The suspicion was that organophosphates were causing the trouble, because some of the symptoms were similar to those that you get with organophosphate compounds at the poisoning, and but we were able to show that there was the level of organophosphates was well below the harmful level, so it wasn't that. So they started worrying then, well, what's the health effects of long-term low-level exposure to organophosphates? Well, we felt that the problem was that there was a wide range of individual symptoms and signs. If you've got a heart attack, you've got pain in your chest, pain up the left side of your neck, you're short of breath. If you've got diabetes, you show all the signs of hypoglycemia. If you have aerotoxic syndrome, there is no set of symptoms. And what we found was that if we took all the symptoms, they were the same sort of symptoms that were reported in drug trials, in anything else. And if you go and ask someone, have you felt dizzy in the last week? The answer is, well, yes, probably have. Did you have a headache this week? Did you have a headache when you flew? Yeah, I did. And you can see where we're coming from. We've got these leading questions, which are bringing in the report of symptoms. Now, these symptoms existed. Let me make that clear. No one is saying they don't. But they're the normal symptoms experienced by most people on frequent occasions. And 70% of the population get them. And there's no consistency, and the United States National Academy of Sciences and the Aerospace Medical Association did a lot of research looking into the aerotoxic syndrome to see whether we did indeed have a new medical condition. And the conclusion is that we don't. So what's its prevalence? In the UK, in the year 2013, out of 20,000 people, they, on their medical database, 28 pilots were diagnosed with aerotoxic syndrome, whatever that meant. There've been no new cases. Okay, and what we had was a cohort of people who experienced symptoms of some sort. You know, I'm a doctor, I listen to the patient. They did experience symptoms, but the symptoms could not be attributed to any poison in the cabin air. Okay, and we could explain a lot of the symptoms with other forms of physiology. Anxiety. When you get anxious, you get tingling in your fingers, you get hyperventilation, you get tunneling of vision, and many reported cases, not all, but many reported cases could be shown to be related to stress or anxiety or something going on. If you think that you're about to be poisoned, you're naturally anxious. So we could understand. And what was difficult was to disentangle the physical, the psychological, and the emotional components of well-being. And we all know, don't we, that different people may respond in different ways on different occasions, and we all have different sensitivity. The reported clinical symptoms are real, but when we look at the whole spectrum, the whole number of crew worldwide, this became a worldwide study, not just a British Airways study, and it only affects a very small number of crew, and those we cannot relate them to any poisonous thing in the cabin. And many cases have said explained by well understood physiology. Now, some people are genetically sensitive. I can't drink coffee. Coffee makes me very unwell. I hate the taste. And interestingly, when I was a child, my mother used to make milky Nescafe, and I never kissed her. And I now know I didn't kiss her because of the taste of the coffee on her lips. I couldn't stand it, even as a child. So she thought I was a very strange child, that I didn't like kissing my mother. But it was the coffee. So I've got something in my genetics that is against chemicals. So maybe the various chemicals in the cabin, there may be people who are sensitive and upset by those smells and by those things. That's fine, you know, but it's not necessarily the cabin air. And as I said there, the TCP is unlikely to be cause to patron. Now, I was lucky enough to work for British Airways when we still had Concorde, and we were very interested in the radiation field at altitude, and because when we look at radiation, where we get it from, cosmic radiation up in the high in the atmosphere is potentially of some concern. So we were long before my time in BARS, and I you know, Frank Boss about come back in a minute, did huge amount of work, not my work. Okay, so I'm not claiming the radiation work, but what I am claiming is the further research and the further examination of what radiation was doing, because with Concorde it was up there at 60,000 feet. It was only up there for 2 or 3 hours and it was down, so the exposure time was quite low. What we were concerned about was the introduction of the ultra long range flights that were going over the polar regions where there is more ionizing radiation, and so the 74s going to Japan over the pole were being exposed to radiation for a longer period of time. So that's why we got invented. What is this radiation thing? Well, here we are. When the black hole happens, when a solar system collapses, all the energy comes out as ionizing radiation. And I'm not, again, this is another evening's lecture, so I'm not going to go into any detail about it, but we do know that we're getting radiation from deep space. Also, we get radiation from the sun, and the sun has an 11-year cycle, as you know, and when we get the solar flares and the coronal mass ejections, they shove out huge amounts of radiation. Nothing to do with UVA and UVB. I'm not talking about sunburn. I'm not talking about tanning. I'm talking about the ionizing radiation which the sun's producing. The good news is God looks after us, because when the sun gets very active, it influences our magnetic field. So here we got Earth in the middle there. There's the sun, and the magnetosphere from the sun deflects the deep space cosmic radiation. So while we're being flooded with the solar ionizing radiation, the deep space stuff is being deflected away by the magnetosphere, which is great. And we needed to do some research, and I worked with the National Radiological Protection Board and others at Harwell, and with Mike Davis, my boss, and we looked at the whole field and how it was going to affect the 747s on the long polar things. Now, the problem with doing research, of course, is up at 40,000 feet here, the field is very different from it is at ground level. So we had to so in the laboratories we had to simulate this field, and it's nigh on impossible actually, and the only way to do the work was to actually go flying with detectors. Excuse me while I just have a swig of water. So we did a lot of work, and the outcome was good news, because we showed that the maximum exposure that we were giving our crew was equivalent to nuclear fuel handlers who are well protected and well thing. So it's of no concern. We're within the legislation. And when we looked at the epidemiology of our crew, this was the good days, that when pilots joined British Airways, they never left. That's all changed now. But up to about 1992, so we had all the data on this, and we looked at 133,500 pilot person years of observation. What we found was life expectancy for pilots was better than the general population. Now, I know you've got the healthy worker effect, you've got giving them regular medicals and so on, but there's more to it than that. And certainly when we compared them with air traffic controllers, who also get medicals, the crew members were living longer. Long haul crew living about 4 to 5 years longer. Short haul crew, the reason they didn't live quite so long is more of them died in motorcycle accidents and light aircraft accidents. So that was the difference there. Now, the marker, the doctors here will know that the marker for ionizing radiation is leukemia. And we expected to see cases of leukemia, as you would in any population. And we were pleased to see that the cases of leukemia were far less than expected. And there was no excess of cancer. So we were able to say, okay, they are getting exposed. We have to monitor their radiation exposure. We have to limit their radiation exposure by the way we schedule them, but we're not actually harming their health. And certainly it's of no concern. And this study in epidemiology was duplicated by Air New Zealand and by Iberia. And Iberia, we work very closely with Iberia, and Iberia carry new cosmic radiation detectors on their aircraft routinely, and they share that data with British Airways. So, excuse me, in summary, we know that galactic cosmic radiation is a natural part of air travel. You're exposed, that's fine. We've got to assess the occupational exposure, and it's a function of all those things, how high you are, where you're flying, and we've shown that travellers are unlikely to be at risk. Now, you might say, why did you spend all that time and money to come up with, well, it's no problem? Well, you've got to do the research to show it's no problem. And sadly, you know, my BARS colleagues sitting at the back, they don't have time to do all this stuff anymore. And it's a shame, because not only did it enhance our work, make our work interesting, we contributed to the fitness of the world population of aviation. And BA was recognized as a leader. And we mentioned earlier, I was the president of the Aerospace Medical Association. I was the first non-American, and that was recognition of BA's leadership in aviation medicine. You know, not me. I happened to be the guy that was appointed, but it was really recognition of what BA had done in the field of aviation medicine. It's already been mentioned that I was honorary civilian consultant advisor to the Army, and I'm ex-Air Force, so I loved it that the Army had to come and get an Air Force chap to advise them in aviation medicine. So it's great, it's good. And you'll notice that I was actually at the Army advisor longer than I was in the Air Force. I was in the Air Force for 16 years, and I was, excuse me, at the same time with the Army. So while I was doing all this medical stuff, and by the way, my time at BARS was not just doing research. I was responsible for the occupational health delivery to the airline. I was responsible for all the aviation medicine delivery to the airline, and excuse me, I was responsible for policy and for stuff. So it wasn't all research, I have to say. I had clinics, and in those days at Speedbird House, we actually ran GP clinics for the crew. I used to prescribe contraceptives to the cabin crew and things like that. You know, it was. I used to warn them about the captains as well. But you know, it was a busy life, and then towards the end of that time, I was appointed advisor to the Army, which I really enjoyed and got a lot out of, and I kept my flying going. And as was mentioned, that I used to sneak away to Farnborough and fly business jet. And my best, that's a Hawker 800, there's me, and and that's me with black hair, by the way. And I'm wearing an A&R headset. So there you go. Now, my best trip used to be Sunday. On Sunday, we would position the aeroplane in Paris, and we'd pick up the finance director of the organisation we flew for, and he would be brought back to Farnborough Business Airport first thing on Monday morning to attend the board meeting on the Monday. So what would happen is I'd fly the aeroplane out to Paris Sunday night with another crew member. We'd stay overnight in a hotel, have a nice Paris meal, and then very early in the morning whiz back to Farnborough. And of course, with the time change, it was brilliant because I'm an hour ahead, so I could be back in bars, my captain's uniform hidden in behind my door, and there I was, head of medical services, British Airways. Good morning, sending the first patient. And I'd just flown back from Paris, and it was great. I used to do that 2 or 3 times a month, and that was great fun. Anyway, all good things come to an end. Bars changed, and there was a reorganisation in the company, and previously BA Health Services reported direct to the chief exec, so there was no bias. You weren't representing anybody other than the health of the whole employee population. It was decided that BARS would now report to another member of the executive team. There was going to be a reorganisation, so I was very happy to take redundancy. So my role as it stood didn't exist anymore. That was fine, because it just so happened that the great Professor John Ernsting, who is our great guru in aviation medicine, at whose feet we all worshipped, decided to retire as professor at King's College. And guess what? I got a phone call. And I was appointed, as you've heard, I became Director of Aviation Medicine at King's College and was appointed as a professor, which is great. It's very nice being a professor. You know, you put your little badge on your pajamas and you say, I'm a professor. You know, and it's rather, I'm very proud. My younger daughter has just been appointed a professor in something else. So we've now got 2 Professor Bagshaws in the family, which I'm very proud of. I'm as proud of that as my dad was when I won the aerobatic trophy, I think. So there you go. So I taught at King's, I taught aviation medicine, I got involved in research, I taught physiology at Cranfield. I'm still on the advisory board at Cranfield, and I'm still visiting professor at King's College. So I teach doctors, I teach physiology and so on. And the nice thing was, as I said earlier, I got involved with human factors. So I published a book, Human Performance Limitations. But more useful, if any crew members in the room, your real human factors textbook is available online, and it's CAP 737, which is a publication from the CAA, and it's freely available. You've got to spend money to buy my book, and it's out of date anyway, whereas CAP 737 being online is permanently up to date. So anyone who's interested, go and have a look for CAP 737. I still fly. I've just sold my twin Comanche. Actually, it was just getting too expensive to run, so I had a bereavement. I'd owned it for 10 years, but I've still got a share in the Bulldog, and I still fly, and I'm still an examiner for the CAA, so I keep flying, and there we go. Well, occasionally your friends drop in, and when your friends drop in unannounced, there's usually human factors behind it. So I got very interested in the whole thing, and as you've heard, I was privileged to be appointed chairman of the UK General Aviation Safety Council, which is something I enjoy, and we're making a difference. We're trying to save lives through education, and I think we do a reasonable job. And of course, the whole point of safety, the whole point of aviation medicine really is we want it to be like that. We don't really want it to be like that. The good news, he survived. I wouldn't have actually put a slide up if he'd died, but he did survive. But it was all a bit messy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, and to my friends online, there's the big wink I promised my sister. She's watching from Canada, so I said I'd wink at her. Ladies and gentlemen, that's brings me to the end. That's my gallop through aviation medicine. At the age of 76, 77, I'm still doing it. I'm still busy. It keeps me young, and it's great. And what I do enjoy about being a professor is bringing on the next generation. The sad news is that nobody else will ever be able to do my career, because the regulations for keeping current, the need for continuing professional development, both as a professional pilot and as a doctor. One of the reasons of the doctor shortage in the UK is all the hoops that have to be jumped through now by people in the medical profession. They spend the time box ticking, they spend the time showing signs of development, getting feedback from patients instead of actually seeing patients. And of course, I trained as a GP, it took me 1 year. I trained as an occupational physician, it took me 1 year. I trained as a surgeon, I got my membership of the Royal College of Surgeons, it took me 2 years. Now a GP has to do 4 years training. An occupational physician has to do extra training after he or she has already done specialist training. A surgeon now, a surgeon's career takes forever to qualify, and things are more complex. Things have changed, and much of it is for the good, and the technology and the skills and what medicine can do now is absolutely amazing. When I was a consultant, I used to deal with the ear, the inner ear and the middle ear, and if somebody got a condition called otosclerosis, where the 3 little bones fuse together, there's nothing you can do. Now with 3D printing and graphene, we can produce new ossicles. And that's magic, okay? And that's how it's gone on. But it means you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a pilot. And I know that we've had many doctors who fly. We still have, Virgin has a captain who's qualified. In BA, we've had qualified doctors flying the line, and that's great. But to have that deep involvement in aerospace medicine, which I'm so privileged to have had, I'm afraid your grandchildren can't do that anymore. It's a great shame. So, ladies and gentlemen, hope for questions. Thank you very much.
Questions? What do you think is what you'd like to have done that you didn't have the opportunity? Is the next research that you?
I'm very interested in cockpit displays and eye movement within the cockpit. When we, with old-fashioned basic aircraft instruments, you developed what's called a scan. So but you develop what's called a scan pattern, where you scan the instruments in a particular way, and you get the information you need. Now with glass cockpits and screens, all that information is displayed on a screen, and there's far more information available than there was before. And what we're finding is that pilots are not following a particular scan pattern, and they're missing things. And I think that's what I'd like to do work in. And I'm concerned about the move towards single pilot, and I'm concerned about the stress levels and so on. So that's what I'd like to do next. Thank you for nice question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Very interesting. I've got a question about psychological testing of pilots and medical, during a pilot medical.
Yeah.
I mean, there was this case in Switzerland, I believe, of a pilot sort of a commercial aircraft committed suicide.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering whether you think the psychological testing, is appropriate.
Certainly. Yes, and always just to thank you. It's a very nice question. Thank you. Taking it back a bit, the AME, the Authorised Medical Examiner, the Aviation Medical Examiner, has always had a duty to examine the mental and the physical and the whole being. But it's very difficult. It's easy to measure blood pressure. It's very, very difficult to tell someone's working. And the first officer who committed suicide and murdered all those people by flying into the Alps, he covered up his mental illness. People didn't know. I mean, he reported for duty that day. The captain was not suspicious, and he had this deep-rooted psychological illness, which we all know the outcome. And the question is, coming back to your question, really, is how can we test it? And now we do have a statutory duty to do psychological assessments, but how effective they are, I'm not sure really. None of you know how I feel this evening. You've heard I've got a cold, you can hear that, but you don't know if I'm depressed or whether I'm happy. And that's the difficulty, and it's so easy to answer the right questions in psychological screening. So the answer to your question is something has to be done. I'm not sure we've got the right tools. Yeah. So,
Couple of questions. The aerotoxicity.
Yeah.
Since you did the research, the controversy has gone on.
yes.
What are your comments on it going on, given your research, which
It is continuing. In fact, there's a 2-day conference in Germany early next year, and that there is I've got to be careful what I say, because these people are very committed, but there are some people who are very concerned about it, and have, in my view, have got it out of proportion, and they've become fixated. It's rather like the climate change people gluing themselves to the road. We've got a cohort of people internationally who firmly believe that their health and other people's health has been affected, and they're keeping the thing going. And research keeps being done and coming up with the same conclusions. And what's very interesting is when we show that it wasn't organophosphates, they chose other chemicals, and we were able to show it wasn't those chemicals. And sadly, as I mentioned earlier, many of the physical symptoms that people get, which they ascribe to the aerotoxic syndrome, may well be caused by hyperventilation or anxiety or stress. And there's still worrying symptoms: dimming of vision, tingling in your fingers. And because of all the publicity, they assume that they're being poisoned when they're not. So it's continuing. Education. I've done my best. I've been beaten up really big time by the media. There's a horrible interview with me on which you can get on YouTube. Please don't watch it, where an Australian journalist actually beat me up big time. And it's real passion. And but there are not new cases. As I said earlier, there are no new cases. It's the same people.
my other question.
Yes.
Some people in this room may know that I've had a long association with the huge spy plane. And there, of course, you've got pilots that are flying at 7,000 feet.
Yes.
For hours at a time, and got pilots that were actually less, 2,000 to 3,000 hours. The radiation survey and work that you did it point to more serious problems for people exposed for much longer than the airline people? Because some of those pilots, retired pilots, have considered that some of their cancers and so on in later life caused by this. The Air Force did the US Air Force did a survey a long time ago now for high flyer. But anyway, any comments on that?
Yes, I was involved in that survey through my work at Aerospace Medical Association, and what we were able to find is that when you looked at the cancers, they were not related to radiation exposure. There were a lot of cancers, but there are in any population. In this room, a proportion are going to get cancer, and there was no relationship between the cancers they had and radiation exposure. And actually, the levels we're talking about are still quite low. Nothing like going to Mars. You wouldn't get me going to Mars, because you're going to get big doses of radiation. And when we look at the astronauts who are getting large doses of radiation when they break free from the Surly bombs, the only thing they have in excess is eye cataracts. But we're not seeing more cancers in the astronauts. The worry in the high flying U2 guys, of course, was the plaques in the brain, the change in brain structure, and that's subsequently been shown to not perhaps be as clear as it was.
Yeah, that's more related to
Decompression. Yes. Yeah, I wasn't relating that to radiation, but I'm just saying that's the health that was the health concern rather than radiation.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So,
What's your favourite type of aircraft?
oh, the Hunter.
Hunter, yeah.
Hunter. I used to display the Hunter. I've got a couple of thousand hours on the Hunter, and I love it.
Yeah, real pilots, yeah.
Yes, the one with the propeller would be the Chipmunk.
Any more in the room?
Let's do a follow-up to this gentleman's question about the mental health one.
Yes, sure.
One of the issues, as I seem to remember, with the German was the lack of disclosure or the questions about privacy.
Yes.
Do you have views on whether we've got the balance between patient privacy and public safety rights?
Well, just to give the background to that, the German laws were such that you were not allowed to share medical information. So even if you knew this gentleman was depressed, that his doctor was not allowed to tell anybody. And you may know that Lufthansa is not allowed to keep electronic records of its medicals. They're all because of German laws. But as a result of the German wings accident, that law was changed as far as medical is concerned. And certainly in the rest of the world, I can't speak for China and I can't speak for Russia, but certainly in the rest of the Western world, there is plenty of freedom to share. And when a pilot goes for his or her medical, they sign a thing to say, yes, you can contact my doctor. So yes, and one of the courses I run at King's College, in fact, is giving doctors, GPs, an insight into aviation medicine, so they know the importance of it. So the answer to your question is, I am confident. Yes, thank you.
Theme, really. I've
Yeah.
followed the MH370 mystery at all. For instance, do you know whether Malaysia Airlines was doing psychological testing of its pilot?
They weren't, but they are now.
Do you have a theory on that?
I think the evidence, and I'm just like one of you now. So my personal opinion on the evidence we have, that it was probably a murder-suicide. It was probably the captain. But I don't have any more insight than you do. So.
A decrease of patient tube dysfunction. Have you done any study in your time?
Yes, I have. Yep, and we looked at cabin crew in particular. This was eustachian tube dysfunction affecting the middle ear. There was a study done in America which I reviewed and did indicate a higher prevalence of middle ear disorder in cabin crew. Yes, yeah, and that's why in the good old days, when I was first here, we had a health centre in the Compass Centre. And the Compass Centre was the report centre for the crew, and they lived there actually, effectively. And the good news was that they were able to pop into the health centre and have their ears checked just before the flight. We could stop them flying there and then. Now having to come all the way over here, they perhaps don't get the checks as often as we perhaps think they should. But don't fly with a cold. I was due to fly yesterday. I was due to do a flight test. I cancelled it because of my cold. The trouble is, of course, that if you don't fly, you don't get your allowances, and there's trouble, if you're not fit to fly, it causes all sorts of other repercussions and things. So there is pressure on the crew perhaps to fly, self-imposed pressure to fly when perhaps they shouldn't. Yeah.
There are some questions online. So from Andrew coming. Is enough research being done in the field of aviation medicine, and if not, what can be done about it?
Okay, there is. Good evening, Andrew. There is a lot of research being done, both at King's College London and at the RAF Centre for Aviation Medicine at Henlow. We went through a dip when the Institute of Aviation Medicine was closed. The amount of research was done, but it was reduced. But the Centre for Aviation Medicine now is doing a lot of research, and King's College has a very active research unit. And what can be done? We need funding. We need people. We've now got aviation medicine as a specialty, and we're funding a number of PhD students who are doing research. So the answer, Andrew, is it's back, it's coming, and but we'd like some more money, please. Yeah.
Got another question. I think it's also from an ex-colleague of yours, it's for Peter Soult. So the question is, why did the medical officer pilot program stop? Do you think US Air Force still has them?
Right. Why did the medical officer pilot program stop? Because the training required for a fast jet pilot became lengthier and more expensive. I got my wings after 2 years of training. Now it's 4 or 5 years of training. The aircraft are flying less, more time is spent in the simulator, and it's too expensive, and there are not enough people available. I think that's the short answer.
There's one final question, and it's actually potentially a hot topic. Hypothetical question. If you run the CAA, what would you change?
Whoa! Right, how long have we got? Well, the CAA is tasked by the Department for Transport to provide its services, and it's run by a board. And the chairman of the board is Sir Stephen Hillier, who is a very highly regarded. And the board do a great job, and they set the strategy. The problem we've got is, as with everybody else, is the finding people with the appropriate experience to do the tactical development. And certainly in the licensing area, we've had a lot of concerns about the time taken to deliver licensing, inconsistencies, the lack of trust from the CAA to their flight examiners, for example, and everything having to be double checked. What I'd like the CAA to do is to take a leaf out of the John Timpson book of management, which is you manage, you run it, you deliver, and we'll back you up at management level. And unfortunately, there is still a tendency for cross-checking, not trusting, and mistakes being made. Having said that, we've got some great people working the CAA, and I know some of these issues are being addressed. So it's not a criticism of any individual. That they're doing a splendid job, but they're hidebound by this old traditional method of management.
Any final questions in the room? On behalf of the committee and all the members of the London Heathrow branch, thank you for coming to talk to us tonight. I've certainly enjoyed hearing you talk about your unique life. I was in the Air Force. I fly little aeroplanes. I can find no way of merging everything together. You are my hero. I offer you my best wishes, the wishes of the branch. Best wishes for Christmas to your family and yourself, New Year, and for your future. Thanks for coming. Token of our appreciation. Again,
Thank you.
thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Peter.
Happy Christmas.
Thank you very much indeed. My mother used to tell me off. She used to say, "Stop showing off, Michael."
I don't see it as showing off. But
Yes, that's right.
You're unique. That's the best way to
Right.
describe it.
And I'd like to say thank you. I appreciate your words, and I'd like to thank you all for giving up your evening to come and listen to me. And I wish you all well. Season's greetings. Stay healthy.
Okay, say thanks ever so much. Good night. Happy Christmas. Goodbye for now. Thank you, Mike.
Pleasure. Thank you.